First item of business would be any requests for bill introductions. Do we have any requests? I haven't forgot my own today. I don't have any, so we're good. Next item would be we had some minutes for approval that I announced yesterday. Were there any additions or corrections to the minutes? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve. Representative Francis and a second from Representative Howerton. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Next item of business is a hearing on House Bill 2211, and I'll turn to the reviser for an overview on that bill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2211 provides funding to replace lost food sales tax revenue for star bond districts that were established prior to December 31st of 2022, and also modifies under the star bond law the tax increment definition for such districts. Under Section 1, this would establish the star bonds food sales tax revenue replacement fund. Under the bill, the Secretary of Revenue would be required to calculate the amount of revenue that would have been generated from the sale of food and food ingredients for each star bond project district established prior to December 31st of 2022, and that if the rate had been at 6.5%, the star bond project district would receive the differential amounts going back through 2024 for the difference in the revenue. And then this amount would also, the differential amounts would also go forward until the expiration of the bonds. Under Section 2 of the bill, it modifies the definition of tax increment under star bonds to include the amount of revenue equal to the amount of sales and use tax revenue that would have been derived from the sale of food and food ingredients within the district. For star bond project districts established on or after December 31st of 2022, the base year revenue would not include revenue resulting from the sales of use tax on sale of food and food ingredients within the district. So there's kind of that change between including or excluding depending on when the date that the star bond district was established. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Committee, are there any questions? Do you know, and maybe this is a question for the proponents, establishing that date in Section 2, as you mentioned, you know, we kind of phased out the food sales tax, but is that a way just to kind of go back and recover that full 6.5%, even though it wasn't completely phased out at that point?
The date of December 31st, 2022, I'd have to look back at when, I don't know if that's the date that the bills were first discussed dealing with food sales tax or if that was when they were implemented. I'd have to check.
Okay, that's fine. All right, seeing no further questions. Thank you for that, Adam. And we'll now turn to Department of Revenue for an overview on the fiscal note.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Kathleen Smith with the Department of Revenue. We are estimating that House Bill 2211 would decrease state general fund revenues by authorizing transfers from that total of $15.9 million from the state general fund to the Star Bonds Food Sales Tax Revenue Replacement Fund in fiscal year 26. That period would include the months from January of 2024 through April of 2025. The estimate for fiscal year 27 would be $8.2 million, and then for fiscal year 28, the estimate would be $8.2 million as well. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for questions.
Thank you, Kathleen. Do we have any availability, and again, this might be a question for the conferees as well. Do we know what projects, can we kind of detail line item this to know exactly how much money is allocated for each one of these existing projects?
I think that can be done. I need to check my confidentiality statutes, though I'm not sure that I would be able to provide that information to you.
That's what I was afraid of, so okay. Thank you. Committee, are there any questions for Department of Revenue on the fiscal note? See none. Thank you, Kathleen. We'll now open up our proponent section testimony and welcome first to committee Keel Mangus. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Kyle Mangus. It's spelled funny. My parents, I don't know why, but appreciate you allowing me, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, and members of the committee for allowing. I'm the city manager of the city of Derby. We are a community that's impacted by the Starbond food sales tax reduction. We stand in support of House Bill 2211 as it remedies an unintended consequence of the phasing down and eliminating of the state sales tax on food. The phasing out of state food sales tax is helpful. It's appreciated by Kansas. I know it's appreciated by members of our community, but the policy did cause an unintended impact on our existing Starbond district that had grocery components. The food sales tax elimination eliminates a substantial portion of revenue generated and allocated to pay down those bonds. This revenue reduction does have the negative effect of significantly extending the life of their bond repayment beyond what was considered in the project economics when the project was approved. The Department of Commerce, to answer your question about 2023, the Department of Commerce budget, the state budget, had money in 2023 that was put into their budget to help make Starbond districts whole. So we greatly appreciate that. We were made whole in 2023. And then in 2024, there was originally money budgeted that was taken out of the process. So that's why this bill, I think, goes back to Jan 1 of 24 to allocate just the lost revenue. So we greatly appreciate being made whole in 2023. However, when reimbursement was cut in 2024 and 25, those sales tax on groceries were part of the revenue pledged by the state to help repay the bonds. So when the state entered partnerships with cities like Derby for those Starbond projects, they encouraged local investment. They said, city, go invest. We're going to invest in these projects. And that investment was based upon a predictable and reliable funding structure. Food sales tax have been a reliable funding structure for a long time. By eliminating the food sales tax without providing that replacement revenue, the state has really put Starbond communities that have those projects at a financial disadvantage. A little bit of detail about Derby. Our successful Starbond district has several grocery components. We're impacted. We have a Dillon's Marketplace, a Target, and Aldi's, and we've had a very successful financial project. Our bonds paid off 15 years early and 16 years early, and our final phase is the one that's most impacted by the lost grocery sales tax revenue. The lost sales tax means that the increased local sales tax revenue, which would go back to our community to help fund critical public services, such as public safety, infrastructure, those dollars are locked in to help repay the Starbond debt for a longer period of time because we've lost that grocery repayment. I would say that House Bill 2211 provides that stable annual funding mechanism to help pay off those debts and to honor the state's original funding commitment. It's not new revenue. This is revenue that the state has already pledged to help repay the bonds. It's just fulfilling those obligations. So by advancing HB 2211, the state helps fulfill that original funding source pledge and ensures a growing community. We're growing in Derby. We appreciate the help from the state. We appreciate the Starbond projects and being a partner in that and helping us continue to thrive without shifting that additional property tax burden onto our residents. So we urge you to adopt 2211, and thank you for your consideration.
Committee, do you mind standing for some questions?
Yes, sir.
We'll go ahead and take questions after each conferee. To my question that I had posed to the Department of Revenue, do you have some math that shows, you know, how much of a percent of a reduction has this been to your annual revenue, and what kind of extension, how much longer it's going to take?
In our specific case for Derby, we estimate it's around $700,000 a year in lost revenue from the grocery sales tax for the Starbond repayment. Each community, there's several communities that are impacted, in some very minor, some with more, like us. I know you'll hear from the city of Goddard. They're one of the ones that's more impacted. So I think every little bit, so I don't have the numbers from every community, but I know for us that's kind of where we're at.
Thank you. Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when were these bonds first issued?
Our last phase of bonds were issued in 2022.
Okay. And I know that we've been having somewhat serious discussions about eliminating the food sales tax since at least 2019. So I'm kind of surprised that you're characterizing as this came as a surprise to you, because it's been talked about for several years, And then, even then, it was phased out. It wasn't, so I mean, you had to see this coming, yes?
Well, I think and I appreciate that, Representative Sanders. I think there's lots of discussions that occur at the state level about sales tax and what that means. Those projections and when the bonds are sold, the state is a partner in that process. So when we do those projections from a city perspective, and as you all know, it's mostly state money. I mean, Star Bonds is state money, and we appreciate that investment in that partnership. Our heartburn really has to do is the transition by pulling out that state funding. Whether we saw that forecast or not, and when that was going to happen, those bonds are issued. It's shifting that burden, and that's the heartburn we have. It's shifting the burden from the state to the local level.
Well, certainly you recognize it's heartburn for us too. If you've been around the building at all this year, you can feel the heartburn that we're having too. So the real problem I have here is if we vote for this, everybody's going to be coming and asking for it. I'm just a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions, committee? Representative Carlin and then Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nice to see you, Kyle.
Good to see you.
I haven't heard from Manhattan about this bill, and I was looking to see if the cities are named in the bill, or if you can you tell me if it's?
Manhattan is impacted by this. It's more minor.
We're about to pay off.
Yeah, their timing is a little bit different.
But is it listed in the bill, the cities listed to the point he made about everybody was going to come and ask for it?
I don't believe so.
We just, if you're impacted.
Yeah, it had to have been bonds issued before 2022. So nobody who comes forward now and asks for something is eligible for that. So any new project, they have to take into account there is no food sales tax and groceries. Right. So it's the prior ones that were issued, and Manhattan was one of the earlier ones in Star Bonds.
Like it was 20 years ago or about 20 years ago that those were issued. So we're nearly at the end. Do you remember if that was a 20 or 30 year?
20 years.
Yeah.
When I worked for the city, they would already had paid off a large portion.
Well, I think that just if anyone might not have been involved in the conversations, the deal was, yeah, we from Manhattan will support this project going forward, but with the sales tax going off, we'll be covered. And that was a deal. And now I'm happy to hear how you explained that, because I hadn't realized that we actually did it in that step down way that you talked about. So,
yeah, the state in 2023, was, like I said, it was very appreciated when they made whole, because that was the first small steps down the state. I think it went to 4.5 or
0.5%.
Yeah, it went down a little
first
bit.
6 months.
So it was
something.
a smaller amount, and that was put in the Department of Commerce budget appropriation, I believe, that year. And then the attempt was made in 2024, I think at the end of the legislative session. As you all know, the Star Bond bill got really complicated at the end of 2024 with the chiefs and everything, and kind of shifting and moving, and that money was taken out of there. So there's a lot of activity there. But yeah, we appreciated that in 2023.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope that might help to clear up questions, because this is just something that I didn't realize we needed to spell out these years as well. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just a curiosity first and then a question. So I'm not familiar with Derby and your use of Star Bonds, but you mentioned that you have several grocery store components, a Dillon's, a Target, and an Aldi's. As I look at some other testimony that lists projects, the only project I see in Derby is a Field Station Dinosaurs Phase 1 and Phase 2. So why are grocery stores such a heavy component of a Star District?
So when the district component was built in 2015 timeframe, it was drawn around an area that was not developed or in the process. So that included the Field Station Dinosaurs component 1 and 2. Our second phase of Star Bonds was the multi-sport component. So we have a sandbox and a climbing component. And then the third phase is the one that's currently in the process of being built. This is a Crystal Lagoon hotel, amphitheater. So it's the way the district was drawn. I can't speak to, I didn't work for the city then, but it's the way the district was drawn and then what's developed in that area. Dillon's was there. I know that back then. I don't believe Aldi's and Target were completed at that time frame, so.
Okay, thanks for that. And I guess the next question is, you mentioned that this would have the effect of significantly extending the life of the bond repayment. I know some of these bonds and other projects have gone longer than anticipated. So what's the implications for it actually just playing out longer than it was planned?
Well, I think based on our estimates, it could range anywhere. It's hard to say based on sales tax forecast. As you know, that's more volatile, but anywhere from 5 to 8 years, we estimate it could swing one way or the other. Kind of depends on Derby being a growing community. It's helping us on the local side. Our sales tax has been increasing over the years, so that's helping us pay these off quicker. And I think for us, we want them to pay off quicker because then we get, our portion of the countywide sales tax coming back. We get our transient guest tax coming back. So yeah, we've loved that they're continuing to pay off, and by extending that, it's just kind of locking those up a little bit further. So and when I say extending it out, we plan on them paying off early. It's not extending it past the 20 years. We've always planned on them paying off early. So then the state gets their money back, we start getting ours. It's just the life of when it pays off and how early.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Sawyer.
I want to follow up on that. When we create the Star Bonds districts, the whole idea is that the people using those districts, pay for the Star Bonds. The general taxpayers aren't on the hook. So it seems to me that the best way to handle this, obviously you would expect that food sales has to go up, but is to do what you would have to do is just extend them longer. So again, the people in the district that are using it would pay for it. This bill would have general fund revenue, which really changes. We don't, the whole idea of Star Bonds is we don't put the general taxpayers at risk. So I don't know. It seems like you're asking for a big change in how we look at these projects.
Yeah, and I appreciate that perspective, Representative. I definitely think that the intent of that Star Bond is, to bring out of state, to bring tourists to come in there to pay those costs, and the local community pays those costs. They go shop, they go do that. I think our big thing is, again, it's not asking the taxpayers at large. This is money that was going to go to those Star Bonds to pay it off in our view, and it's shifting some of that burden to the local level, to those taxpayers and representatives in the city, because we still have to provide those services. So that revenue that's locked up that we could use to hire another police officer, we could use to hire a firefighter, that's now locked up for however much longer it may be.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So maybe I misunderstood what was happening originally. Are you having to supplant with mill levy monies and other sales tax monies to make these payments? Or are the actual sales tax proceeds from within the Star Bonds district still able to make the payment?
So the actual district itself is paid back within the district itself. So I think what our argument is at the local level is by extending that out, that countywide sales tax, that helps supplant property tax for us, that distribution. So we're locking that up for that much longer when that revenue could have been available at the local level. Same with transient guest tax.
Right, but the sales tax that are derived from the project can make the payment at this time?
Correct, yes, sir.
Okay.
Any further questions, committee? Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I look further down in your testimony, and you mentioned it in your comments, you said that this is not new revenue, but revenue that the state has already pledged. Could you kind of clarify what that pledge nature is?
So when we go into a Star Bond project, when I say pledged, we have a project agreement with the state and us and the project developer that says, and then we go issue Star Bonds. And in our case for Derby, there's some communities that have backed their bonds with revenue, local revenue. Ours are purely backed by the buyer of the bond. So, you know, that's the other party that I didn't really talk about that's kind of harmed by this is the buyer of the bond that was expected that repayment. But that repayment is through that agreement. So they've already said, the state knows we have this much revenue that's coming in here and going to repay this bonds. We estimate it'll be over this time frame. And they use financial forecast to kind of look at what that, basing on how they sell that bond. So I guess that's the pledging portion I'm talking about. There's no obligation there because the district has to perform. It has to get revenue. It has to have sales tax to repay it. So some of those sales tax, star bond districts that have not performed, I mean, they're not fulfilling their obligation. In our case, it's performing. It's just leaving a gap because that revenue went away.
So the pledge is essentially the original estimate of what the tax flows would be is no longer relevant.
Correct, yes, sir.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
All right, seeing no further questions, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, sir.
Next, I'd like to welcome Rachel Willis with the Department of Commerce. Welcome to Tax Committee. We don't get to see you in here very often, although you're familiar with this room, I bet.
Yes. Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Rachel Willis, Director of Legislative Affairs for the Department of Commerce. So yes, first time this session, so thank you. We appreciate the time to testify in support of HB 2211. As you've heard, this bill provides funding to replace the lost food sales tax revenue for star bond districts that were established prior to December 31st, 2022. So this bill will really keep those established star bond districts who have stores that sell groceries harmless since the elimination of food sales tax. So the Star Bond Act, so the Sales Tax and Revenue Bond Act, was established in 1999. The bonds are paid off through that sales tax revenue generated by the attraction and the surrounding development in that particular district. The intent is to increase regional and out-of-state tourism, increase economic activity in the state, and provide or improve the quality of life. So currently we have 17 projects, star bond projects at various stages of completion and repayment throughout the state. So you'll see on the backside of my testimony just a chart of those 17 star bond districts and their status. I would like to highlight one of our most successful star bond districts, and that is the Village West District. It provides now over $40 million in sales tax to the state general fund every year, and has created several billion dollars of private investment and tens of thousands of jobs in that particular area. So as Commerce works with developers and communities across the state to establish new districts, it's important that the state demonstrates to our business community stability and consistency. HB 2211 reassures the business community that even though our state policies may change, we will continue to uphold those business agreements that were previously made and ensure that the established districts are not negatively impacted. So again, we just think that this is extremely important to those districts previously established, so none of our new ones, for those specific communities, but also those bondholders. And we ask for your support, so happy to stand for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Committee, are there any questions? Representative Francis.
Thank you for your testimony, Rachel. You always do an excellent job. Are there any of the star bonds that are currently operational that are failing to meet their bond obligations because of the decrease in food sales tax?
Thank you for that question. No, not at this time.
And is there like a minimum payment requirement? I'm not that familiar with star bonds. Is there like a minimum payment that they have to make?
I don't know if I would classify it necessarily as a minimum. So there's a repayment schedule based on that term, which is 20 years, except for the Speedway, which is 30 years. And based on the feasibility study and that increment of new sales tax generated, that's how those payments are calculated.
May I ask one more? And then when we look at these star bonds as a whole, do they generally bring in more sales tax than was originally estimated, less, or about the same? I mean, you know, on the one hand, we're being talked about the fact that because we changed the food sales tax, are bringing in less money than they could be bringing in. But are they actually bringing in less money than was originally projected?
Yeah, so I think it depends on each specific district and that feasibility study. So just like how we saw, the pandemic impacting some of those districts and different development, it just varies between district. For us, we really think that it's more of a policy issue, right? Like that we want to make sure that we're not changing the game in the middle of something that we've already set the goalpost to, right? So that we're not changing how we're going to play and how we're going to say this is successful in the middle, and we've already got that agreement. So we just think, again, that it creates that stability and lets the business community know, lets those bondholders know, lets future bondholders, right, understand that, when we make these projections and when we commit to this collaboratively, we're gonna stick to it. So, and again, the sooner the bonds are paid off, the sooner we're all receiving that sales tax revenue.
Committee, any further questions? Representative Turner.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. So, some of these other projects just fail to draw the original estimated interest in whatever the project is, and therefore I would assume that the payment is extended on the bonds. Is that fair? Just by virtue of the attraction just doesn't attract quite to the level we expect.
Right, so no, none of the bond terms, that 20 years, none of those have been extended. So those, all of our current projects are either paid off within that 20 years, are paid off within that 20 years. So none of them have been extended. You might see fluctuations in their actual payment depending on the year, but they've all been able to meet that 20-year term agreement to this point, right? Like we've got lots still outstanding.
So as the gentleman from Derby talked, one option would be it's just going to take longer to pay these bonds off, right? Are you saying that has to be a formal extension of the original bond terms if the payment stream doesn't satisfy the debt obligation?
Yeah, so sorry, I have to phone my friend, our attorney. So yes, according to statute, the bond term is 20 years. So if a district comes to that 20 years and they haven't paid off their bonds, then we're gonna have to figure something out, and more than likely it would be rewriting that agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any further questions, committee? Seeing none. Oh, just about. Representative Howerton.
So sorry, I probably could have saved the question, but I'm just curious, on this sales tax, is that an automatic payment from the state? Like we collect the sales tax and just pay off the bonds? Or does the city collect it? And then how does it work? How does the payment work?
So our understanding is that the particular district, right, that community would collect it, and it goes to a trustee who makes that payment to that particular bond.
And are they required to make that payment?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, now seeing no further questions, thank you for your testimony. Our last conferee would be Craig Crossett. Welcome to committee. I don't think your mic is on. There should be a little red button up at the top.
Thank you. Honorable Chairman Smith and members of the committee, my name is Craig Crossett, and I am the city administrator for the city of Goddard, Kansas, just west of Wichita on US 54. Appreciate the opportunity to testify today in support of HB 2211. I'm here on behalf of the city. We're a star bond community like many others. We've been significantly impacted by the elimination of the state food sales tax without an accompanying revenue replacement, just as you've heard from my colleague Kyle and Rachel with Department of Commerce. When the state agreed to our projects in 2019 and 2021, which was before the acts of food tax legislation was approved, it entered into a partnership with cities like Goddard, encouraging us to make substantial local investments based on a predictable and reliable funding structure. We actually incurred $3.5 million in local general obligation debt to assist with financing the projects, and the original framework was a key factor in our decision to pursue STAR bonds to develop our community. By eliminating the state food sales tax without the replacement funding source, the state has unilaterally altered that original agreement, leaving STAR bond communities such as Goddard at a severe financial disadvantage. At the close of the last session, we had learned that efforts to permanently fund an account to make STAR bond districts whole had been unsuccessful. Not only did we lose out on that opportunity, but also funding for any reimbursement in 24 and 25 was cut entirely. We do appreciate the one-time reimbursement in 2023. It provided temporary relief, but without continued support, our community is left shouldering an unexpected and unjust financial burden. The consequences of delaying STAR bond repayment in Goddard extend far beyond our balance sheet. Every dollar that remains tied up in our bond debt service is a dollar that cannot be reinvested into critical public services in our community, public safety, including police, infrastructure improvements such as improving our roadways and our stormwater system, and then health and welfare services like our senior center. Until our STAR bonds are fully repaid, all sales tax revenue generated in the district will continue to be diverted to debt service, meaning our city is left with no choice but to look elsewhere, such as raising property taxes. And we have to do that to maintain essential services. Had the food sales tax revenue remained intact, we could pay off our STAR bonds sooner, freeing up these funds for vital city services. To illustrate the real-world impact, consider the analogy. Two colleagues, we have colleague A and colleague B, who form a partnership to borrow $1 million to start a business. Colleague A is the larger partner, agrees to their share of the financial burden, more resources to stand to gain from the business success. But a few years in, that colleague suddenly decides to stop paying their share, forcing colleague B, the smaller and more financially vulnerable partner, to cover more of the costs than they had planned for. The unexpected financial strain prevents colleague B from making necessary investments elsewhere. This is precisely what's happening in our partnership as it stands currently. We entered into the partnership where the state benefited from economic growth and increased sales tax revenue, just as we did, and we took on the risk of local investment, including delayed sales tax revenue and an additional $3.5 million GO bond debt. Now the rules have seemingly been changed, leaving our community to bear the burden. For Goddard, the stakes are high. We're a relatively small community. Our outstanding STAR bond obligation includes $8.5 million of principal remaining from the 2019 STAR bond issue, as well as a little over $11 million in principal remaining for the 2021 issue. In fiscal year 2024 alone, roughly $4 million in sales tax revenue was collected in our STAR bond district, most of which was the state's share. Delaying the STAR bond maturity due to lost food sales tax revenue means the state itself, along with other tax entities, will be delayed in receiving that $4 million in annual sales tax revenue. Furthermore, the delay costs us hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential interest savings, money that could be better spent serving Kansans and citizens of Goddard. We do appreciate the state's recent actions to expand the STAR bond program. We believe it's an excellent program that supported meaningful economic development. However, we have concerns in the logic of expanding the program while simultaneously failing to uphold the previous commitments to existing STAR bond communities. This legislation is not about creating a new financial advantage. It is about restoring fairness and fulfilling the commitments made to our community that relied on STAR bonds in good faith. We would urge the committee to support HB 2211 to ensure that we're made whole. For Goddard, it's a little bit more of an impact. When we entered into this commitment in 2019, our sole source of revenue to service these bonds was a Walmart. We didn't have any other retail in our STAR bond district. And so the grocery sales tax that's collected at that Walmart was very vital, and really the only reason we were able to do it is because we had that. There was a question earlier about, whether there could be a default on the bonds because of this loss in food tax revenue. If we did not have a 1-cent voter-approved sales tax, that would very likely be the scenario for us. That was a real backstop that we were able to rely upon. So this means a lot to us. We are really grateful for the opportunity to come speak with you guys, and we're thankful for the partnership, and we would just ask that you support this bill. I would be glad to stand for any questions.
Thank you. Committee, are there any questions? Could you tell us a little bit more about your district? I mean, I'm hearing that the Walmart's kind of the primary source of revenue here. Are there any other plans for hotels or any other retail outlets that would provide additional revenue?
Yeah, I would be thrilled to do that. So the original project was a $25 million project. It put in 10 state-of-the-art championship-level baseball and softball fields. We're generating over 1 million annual visitors to that facility. We also have a indoor water park, a gymnasium, a 600-seat auditorium, and there's a hotel that has come as a part of that. We've also brought in another multi-sports facility that has a sports bar attached to it. And then we've also seen the attraction of a Dairy Queen, a Brahms, and a Starbucks. The city has been pretty aggressive in trying to bring more commercial retail in. So as far as the purpose of creating the district, we feel like it's been super successful. We have seen additional retail come in, and we have seen additional investment come in as a part of the original projects.
Thank you. Any further questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
That is all I show for appearing before the committee. We also have several written proponents. Is there anyone else wishing to appear as a proponent? Seeing none, I believe we only have written only for opponent testimony. Is there anyone wishing to appear as an opponent? Seeing none, how about neutral? Didn't think so. All right. We will go ahead and close the hearing on House Bill 2211 then. We'll next turn our attention to a hearing on House Bill 2336, and I'll turn to the reviser for a summary on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2336, excuse me, would apportion business income for taxpayers by multiplying the business income by the sales factor. It would also provide for a decrease in corporate income tax rates. Under the bill, sections 1 and 6 provide for a potential decrease to the corporate normal income tax rate starting in 2027. The rate would be decreased in an amount proportional to the tax rate equal to the amount of actual corporate income tax receipt revenues generated compared with the increase in revenue generated from the fiscal year compared to the prior fiscal year. So essentially, you look year over year to determine how much the rate would decrease for the successive tax year. Under sections 2 through 4 of the bill, this would provide that for tax years prior to 2028, financial institutions and businesses may elect income to be apportioned pursuant to the receipts factor for financial institutions and sales factor for business income rather than the current 3 factor, which is receipts, sales, property, and payroll, which is required by Kansas law. However, starting January 1 of 28, all business income would be apportioned by multiplying business income by the sales factor. There's an additional provision where publicly traded companies would be eligible for a deduction that would apply in proportion for the next 9 successive tax years. Under Section 5 of the bill, this provides the requirements for when sales other than tangible property are deemed to have been made in the state, kind of the requirements for sales other than tangible property. And then Section 7 would exclude sales from the sales factor from sales to the affiliated unity by members of a unitary business group. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Adam. And I don't know if I might have missed it when I was reading through the bill, but the kind of the buy down of the corporate rate, does that end after January 20 of 28, or does that continue? I didn't see where it would end.
Yeah, it would not end.
Okay, thank you. Committee, are there any questions for the reviser? Seeing none. Thank you, Adam. Next, we'll turn to the Department of Revenue for an overview on the fiscal note.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Kathleen Smith with the Department of Revenue. We are estimating that House Bill 2336 would decrease state general fund revenues by approximately $115.7 million in fiscal year 26, $89.9 million in fiscal year 27, and $73.1 million in fiscal year 28. This does not include any corporate rate reduction. To formulate the estimates, we did look at the corporate income tax returns for 21 and 22, made the assumption that for tax years 25, 26, and 27, they would choose the apportionment formula that would benefit them. So based upon that, there's probably a negative maybe 42 million per tax year for those years in which the companies make the election. When it does become mandatory, it would be a positive approximately 10.4 million. For the privilege tax, we weren't able to look at the actual returns, so we based upon the corporate income tax rate reduction. We're finding that around, for tax years 25, 26, and 27, again, they would choose the one that would be beneficial for them. So it would be a decrease of around 2.9 million for those specific tax years. And when it does become mandatory, it would be a positive $800,000 in tax year 28. The interstate motor carriers and the railroads, right now they are on a mileage-based apportionment formula. So that would go away, and there would be a negative 35.2 million per tax year for those types of taxpayers. We were able to look at the tax returns for a specific NAICS and make that determination. And then the deferred tax deduction would take effect, I believe, in tax year 35, and we had to base our estimate on another state that does have this in place, and we would be looking at approximately 22.4 million claimed per tax year, but that wouldn't be until the back end of the fiscal year, I believe 35, so it's way, way out there.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. That was a pretty extensive fiscal note. Committee, are there any questions? Representative Sawyer.
I think I heard you right, and this does not factor in the corporate rate deduction. None of this.
It does not include any corporate rate reduction. Based upon what we have now for CRE, we believe that the total corporate income tax receipts to occur in fiscal year 26 are going to be lower than what they were in fiscal year 25. So that wouldn't trigger the rate reduction.
Thank you.
All right, seeing no further questions, thank you, Kathleen. We will now open up our proponent testimony and welcome Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Good afternoon. Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber. I promise it will get better than that fiscal note. We have some ideas, and we'll get into those. So this is year 4 of working on this policy, and I want to, for the new committee members, go into some historical context. So it might be painful, but I feel like it's important for you guys to understand how we got to where we are today. I want to answer the chairman's question on the corporate piece and what the intention is there. I just noticed something looking at the bill language as well. So for background purposes, over 40 states have moved to single factor. So if you're a company operating in all 50 states, or if you're operating in 30 states and you're a C Corp, how do you decide how much is responsible, how much of your total income should be apportioned and attributable to Kansas? So we have the 3-factor formula that is the typical traditional method, that is where you take the payroll, the property, and the sales of the company within the state and use that formula to apportion your income to the state of Kansas, and then you're assessed 7% of 6.5% corporate income tax rate on that income. States started moving, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, it started becoming a thing where states started shifting to single sales factor. And where they eliminate the payroll, they eliminate the property from the calculation, and they only look at the sales within the state. And the purpose behind that is to, and the reasoning and logic behind it is to encourage capital investment, manufacturing facilities to lower and reduce their tax liability so we can attract more economic development, more jobs, more investment within the state. So now we sit today where we have over 40 states, maybe 42, 43 states have moved to single factor. We're one of 6 states that currently use a 3-factor. Oklahoma is also another one, but they're also debating single factor apportionment this session as well. But within a membership organization, our job is to do what our members ask us to do. And we have had members ask us 5 years ago to push for single factor apportionment. But at that time, we were also trying to decouple from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that was a big controversial fight over an unknown uncertainty. What are we trying to remove from the tax base? What are we trying to eliminate in those provisions? And at that time, with the decoupling efforts, that was the priority. We had to get that done because that was timely with the federal tax changes of 2017. So single factor kind of went on the back burner. And in order to address that, we said, okay, our members asked, let's just do an election. For those industries who want it, why don't we just let them choose? Those who want single factor can move to single factor. Those who want 3-factor can go to 3-factor. Had the hearing, talked to the committee, seemed receptive to the idea, and then the department asked, well, what if we just went to single factor? And I think it might have been the day of or the day before it was supposed to be worked. It's like, well, our membership's divided because in this policy there are winners and there are losers. There are some who will see a tax increase. So it puts us in a bind knowing that we have people that are going to be negatively impacted. You know, we're trying to do what's best for our members, right? So there are some who will be negatively impacted, but there are some who will also benefit from this policy change. And overall, the policy change is good, again, going back to why we would do this, and it's to try and attract investment within the state. So that request from the department and Representative Smith and Representative Sawyer kind of put us on pause and got us back to the drawing board of, okay, here's the request, guys. So we put out, and this was maybe first week of March, I think, maybe last week of February. So it was pretty late in the session. And we said, you know what, let's just put a working group together and let's just punt this year, talk about it this summer. So then we got our people who are either opposed or supportive of this concept, got everybody on several Zoom calls to discuss what our future looks like on this. So then that led to the bill last year. It also led to, we've had that agenda item in there about the election. And then in 2024, our board adopted the shift to single factor apportionment. But it would be an election. So this bill contains provisions that our members who are negatively impacted have asked for. The reduction in the corporate income tax. That's intended to be a one-time buy-down. I saw in the bill language when I was looking today, it says for tax year 26. It should be tax year 28 or 29 because we're now up to a 3-year election, which is why the fiscal note is so high, because corporations will take the path of least resistance and reduce their tax burden, right? Those who want to stay at 3-factor will stay there. Those who want to move to single factor will move to single factor to reduce their tax burden. That's why we have such a big fiscal note here. And so some of those other provisions that are in there, that the corporate buy down, again, that's intended to be a one-time. When we shift to single factor apportionment fully for everybody, what is the impact to the corporate income tax revenue to the state? And that difference, say it's 80 million, say it's 40 million, say it's 100 million, it would be a one-time, it's intended to be a one-time buy down of the corporate income tax to help offset any increase for those who are negatively impacted. To your question, Mr. Chairman, it's not intended to be an ongoing and perpetuity thing. It's only when we make that switch to single factor apportionment. The other provision that's in here is a piece known as the deferred tax liability. So if you read through the fiscal note, which is I think 2 pages from the department, there's a provision in there that says in 2035, when this tax credit takes effect, it's going to cost $22 million per year. That deferred tax credit only applies to publicly traded companies. And the reason that is in there is because when a business, and we talked about this last year, it was in last year's bill, when that tax increase hits a company that's publicly traded, it's obviously going to impact their financial statements. So it allows them to defer that tax liability to help keep their financial situation look to be the same, right? So, you know, it doesn't shake their stock prices or anything like that because they're incurring higher tax liability in states that they're operating in. So that's the purpose behind there. So the corporate buy down and that deferred tax liability, as well as the election piece, were reasons why, or were the additional provisions that were put in the bill. So last year, if you recall, we had 2796, which was the Department of Revenue's bill that included single factor apportionment and market-based sourcing. 2798 was our bill that had all of these provisions without the market-based sourcing, but we did ask for feedback from our members, and at that time said, yeah, we're good with market-based sourcing, and then last session people were like, wait, we have problems with market-based sourcing. We got to work through some language there. Again, it's whack-a-mole with our membership, because then, you know, last year we had some members pop in late that's like, oh my gosh, we're going to be negatively impacted here significantly, and that again created some pause. But all good things come to those who wait. Year 4, I think we've ironed through the details, and I think we've worked through some of those concerns that have been there. But the last paragraph on the first page, excuse me, of our testimony, I want you to pay attention to what was said there by one of our members on that call who's 4 miles from the Missouri border. And Missouri just recently, I think 2018, 2019, shifted to single factor, where they said on our call, they said, look, we shouldn't have a tax climate when all these states have moved to single factor that we're 4 miles away from significantly cutting our tax liability by moving across state lines. And we want to stay in Kansas. And that's a compelling argument. It really is. And so it's been a difficult issue to navigate, but ultimately I think we've gotten there. I mentioned that last year's bill did not have the department's language on the market-based sourcing when they asked us to do that. We have that in there now. The cable and again, okay, something else I didn't mention. Geez, I'm like shooting you guys like a fire hose here. Market-based sourcing. The telecom and cable industry has asked for an exemption on that piece, as has the natural gas on the single factor. So those are 2 new pieces that are new to this proposal that were not in last year's bill. And again, each individual company, each individual industry, you can't sit there and say that this industry will benefit and this industry will see a tax increase. It's all across the board, even within the same industry. But the exemption for the natural gas companies in the single factor apportionment, that is for the sale of the natural gas from the service corp to the utility. They're exempting that transaction, which makes sense. It's one corporate entity, right? So even though with that in place, I know some of our natural gas companies have said, even though that's still there, we'll still see a slight increase in our tax liability under the shift to single factor. So thank you to our members who are going to be negatively impacted for understanding why this policy would be good ultimately for the state in the long run. 2, on the market-based sourcing piece, that provision, again, this was the market-based sourcing versus cost of performance. That was a recommendation in our Tax Foundation study that came out in January of 2020 as something to move toward to make consistent in terms of how we source the transaction. And so that piece is in there, but there is that cable and telecom exemption, which we found, I think there were 13 or 14 states that have a similar exemption in place for their industry, again, as they're operating across the country for the services they provide. Their industry is a little unique. All that said, the last piece I want to talk about here falls similarly in line with the natural gas industry, how they have the service corp that sells the gas to the utility. The alcohol industry has the 3-tier system. There's nothing that can be done about that. For the manufacturer, their sale to the distributor, to the retailer, I have highlighted language on page 2 of our testimony that asks for an exemption on that manufacturer's sale to the distributor. Again, there's little that they can control in the 3-tier system. I believe this language is modified from the state of Mississippi to fit Kansas, where they have single factor apportionment and this application for that industry as well. That would be included in this piece, or we're asking for that to be included in this bill here. I believe it would go into Section 3. We were thinking maybe Section 5 at first, but I think Section 3 is where it would go. So all that said, the fiscal note. Anticipating our fiscal note from last year, a similar fiscal note, which we just received, and it is similar to last year, probably a little bit higher, a little bit more detailed, and we appreciate the work from the department. I want to get this issue off the table for our membership who wants it. And our members are probably sick of me talking about it. You're probably sick of taking a day out of the session to talk single factor apportionment. We asked our members, would you be okay if we did a 2-year status quo? No election period, just the next 2 years would be 3-factor. Third year, we go single factor for everybody. So there's no election period. And those who were negatively impacted replied and said, we appreciate you giving us that runway still. We'd appreciate as long of a runway as possible, but as long as we know it's coming, we would be okay with that. So everybody, all the feedback we got on that type of suggested change to this language, everybody would be okay with. But that takes care of the fiscal note because we're not taking that path of least resistance. I don't know what it would do. I would think you could probably scroll through the fiscal note and say, when we go to single factor, what's the impact? Because that's where we would be. So hopefully the department would be open to that type of concept where there is no election period, that it's just 2 years of the 2 more years, current law. Third year, we make that shift. Just to get it on the books, get this issue taken care of, and the feedback that we received on that was positive and encouraged and supported from even those who want it. They know we're not getting it immediately like they want, those who are asking for single factor, but it helps alleviate the fiscal note and the fiscal impact to the state. So I think those are all the points I'm intended to hit today, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time, but I appreciate you guys listening to us testify in support of this bill today.
Thank you. Committee, are there any questions? Representative Sawyer.
Yeah, my first question deals with your testimony. I assume your chart is old because the chart at the end of your testimony shows 29 states have gone to single factor and 6.
I believe so, yeah. Well, and that says for tax year 20, and I know there's been some that have made that change even since. Yeah, Maryland has moved to single factor. They were in a transition as well. Maryland phased it in, I believe, over 3 years as well. Let me see if I can find you a new chart. But we're over 40 states are in single factor. I think it's 42, 43, roughly. So, okay. Yeah.
And then I'm glad you, I'm glad, you know, I have been the last few years wanting to move to the single factor, but these large fiscal notes are like, oh, just can't do it. But so, yeah, I'm anxious. I think your final amendment works for me, but anyway.
On the 2-year status quo?
The 2 year and then the 1 year, just do it, the third year.
Third year, rip the Band-Aid off?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, thanks.
Eric, I wanted to ask you about the language for the interstate motor carriers, and is that similar to what other states have done, or do we need to try to retain an exclusion for them as well?
Yeah, no, the language in the bill is good. I believe, and man, this is going to test me, Mr. Chairman. That was one of the original conversations that we had 4 or 5 years ago where there has been, everything's good today, but there have been some back and forth historically in the motor carrier industry with some regulations from the department that has, I think, been problematic for the industry in terms of apportionment. And so their request from, and this is original bill language, so that's carried over each version, or maybe the second version. I think they were not involved in year one because it was only the NAICS codes. But once we got to the election and then transition, that's when the motor carriers came in and said, hey, can we modify this language here in the bill? And I think it's just striking that section if I remember correctly. But that is more to address a regulation that, and I don't even remember when, it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, there had been some back and forth within the department that caused some tax issues for that industry. And so now they're just saying, can we just strike it all together? I can get you more detail if you need it.
No, that's sufficient. Thank you. Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, I just want to thank you for the work that you have put in. It has been a long, drawn-out process, but I think we've got a really good product here. And with your suggestions in your testimony, I think we could make a few amendments to this and have a pretty good product.
That would be great. I would say our members that are asking for it are they're chomping at the bit, and our members that are negatively impacted, they've been very gracious. But you know, we've been trying to. It's tough in a membership organization when you're trying to find consensus. But again, it's good things come to those who wait. We've been able to work through problems that pop up, right? And that's part of the process of policy. So no, we appreciate your patience with us.
Thank you. Thank you. See no further questions.
Thank you.
And I do not show any other proponents appearing before the committee. Is there anyone else wishing to appear as a proponent? Seeing none, we have one written only opponent. Is there anyone wishing to appear as an opponent? Any neutral? Okay, seeing none, we will go ahead and close the hearing on House Bill 2336. Committee, I want to draw your attention. We always put on our agenda possible action on bills that we've previously heard, but I try to make an effort, if I intend on working a bill, give the committee plenty of notice. So tomorrow, I do want to let you know if you want to prepare any amendments or debate discussion. I do intend on working HCR 5011, the constitutional amendment, and also HB 2098. That was the sales tax exemption for the community theaters. But that's the two that I would like to work for tomorrow. And stay tuned. Next week, we'll probably have several hearings, and we will be working through a number of bills, and I'll try to get that information to you tomorrow, so you can kind of have the weekend to prepare if there's any amendments or anything you want to debate or discuss on those bills. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you for your attention.